Okay, well, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. I'm Jason Kawal. I'm the director of the Lampert Institute for Civic and Global Affairs, and I'm very happy to be introducing Jenna Reinbold this afternoon, Colgate's own. Before turning to Jenna, I just wanted to start with a couple of announcements. So first, our next talk, and this will be the final talk in our human rights series for this semester, will be on Indigenous peoples in global organizations, human rights and the politics of difference. And that will be by Professor Ronald Neisen from the Faculty of Law and Anthropology at McGill University. And that's on Tuesday, November 28th, so the Tuesday after the break at 4:30 here. So again, that's on Tuesday after the break, 4:30 here. I'd also like to mention in passing that there are a number of fellowship opportunities available through the Lampert Institute for both students and faculty. And I would encourage you to take a look at the Lampert Institute website. But for example, for students, we have summer fellowships which offer a stipend of $4,500 and up to $2,000 for travel for independent research. You'll have a faculty supervisor, but it's a great opportunity to pursue projects of your own choosing around the world. And if you look on our website at the center's web pages, you can find the projects from last year's, and indeed all previous year's fellows. So it can give you some sense of the sorts of projects that might be viable. And for faculty, I just mentioned that we also have research fellowships available for you. Take a look at our website, and hopefully you'll find something of interest there. Now, Jenna Reinbold. I should just end there. No. Yeah. So, Professor Reinbold received her BA from Portland State University and her MA and PhD from the University of California at Santa Barbara. She's an assistant professor here in the Department of Religion. Her main interests in terms of scholarship are at the intersection of religion and politics, conservative religious engagements with modernity, and the separation of church and state in the United States, and also such issues as religion and culture wars and so on. She's teaching, well actually I will mention, though her classes are largely full, but for those students, if you're interested afterwards, next semester she's teaching a Core 152, which is already full. She's also teaching a religion in contemporary world where there are a few spots left, so you're okay there. And she's also teaching a new course with Professor Tim Burns in political science on sex law and the American culture wars. And that's entirely full with massive, massive waiting lists. So I think it's a reflection of how well regarded Professor Reinbold is as a professor here and the importance of the issues she's studying. I might also add that she's been a member of the Executive Council of the Lampert Institute for several years, and she's done incredibly helpful work there. I'm really fortunate to have her as a colleague in this regard, and she's done a lot of help, in particular with this particular series on human rights. Just as a final note, she also has a recent book, Seeing the Myth in Human Rights, and I wanted to add something a little bit about Jenna, and she gave me sort of fodder at lunch today. She mentioned that she made some comments in her acknowledgments that I then looked up and thought were worth sharing. So we're really lucky to have Jenna here at Colgate, and I'm not sure we'd realize just how lucky we were to have Jenna at Colgate. So this is from the acknowledgments of her recent book. So she writes, "A number of years ago, I found myself walking outside into a frigid March morning in upstate New York to meet the people who would eventually become my colleagues in the Colgate University Department of Religion. At the time, I didn't actually know that they would become my colleagues. And given the bitter weather of that particular spring, I might have balked just a little bit if I had known that that postdoc for which I was interviewing would eventually grow into a visiting and then a tenure-track professorship." We almost lost Jenna to the weather. But she does go on. What I did know as I headed into the chill of downtown Hamilton was that I felt immediately home in the company of my guide, Christopher Vesey, who's actually here today, who gave me an enthusiastic tour of the...
All to me.
Yes, we all owe Chris a great debt. who gave me an enthusiastic tour, and who in the wake of that first tour has never failed to convey a similar level of warmth and enthusiasm in the face of my various questions, ideas, and dilemmas. Jenna then goes on to say various kind words about the Department of Religion. There is not a shout out to the philosophy department, but we'll forgive her for that. But let's turn to Jenna, and please join me in welcoming her as she speaks on human rights in the era of the alt-right.
Yeah, I did not expect a reading of my acknowledgments, so great, thanks. All right, well, thanks everybody for coming out. I know this is a busy time of semester. And I also obviously want to thank Professor Cable and the Lampert Institute for giving me the opportunity to speak on some of my current research. This is kind of one area of current research that I'm involved in, and I'll bring in a little bit of maybe another area of research that I'm involved in too as I go on. I also want to just give a quick shout out to Sarah Kunze in the ITS for giving me a little bit of much needed technical support in putting together this presentation. So credit where credit is due. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is give a couple of warnings. I'm going to talk about some stuff in this presentation that walks right up to the line of things like white nationalism, sexism, and some covert anti-Semitism. And hey, there's even a hefty dose of kind of anti-Europeanism in what I'm going to talk about, just to warn you Europeans in the room. So it's something for everybody. You've seen the poster for this talk, so there's really no surprise, I think, in what it is I'm going to be talking about. However, there's another thing that I do also want to give a little bit of warning about. I'm going to ask that you listen carefully to some ideas and some voices that I imagine will strike many of you as problematic or perhaps even repugnant. I'm not asking you to listen carefully to these perspectives because I want to convince you to embrace them or anything like that. I want you to listen carefully because, in my opinion, it's impossible to fully understand some of the issues I'm going to talk about without listening carefully to the voices that I'm going to offer. So in that spirit, let's start with Ann Coulter. In the summer of 2014, in the wake of news of an increase in American interest in the sport of soccer, conservative commentator Ann Coulter published a column on her website outlining some of the ways in which this growing interest within the U.S., quote, can only be a sign of the nation's moral decay. I want to take a moment to explore her column while bearing in mind that the points she raises are simultaneously specific to soccer and at the same time evocative of a more general critique of the kind of America that would exhibit a sudden interest in a sport like soccer. Soccer, Coulter asserts, is egalitarian. I know you can't read this, I'm just going to give you a synopsis. Feel free to glance it over if you want. Soccer is egalitarian. Individual achievement is not a big factor in soccer. The blame is dispersed and almost no one scores anyway. There are no heroes, no losers, no accountability, and no child's fragile self-esteem is bruised. It's feminist. A sport in which athletic talent finds so little expression that girls can play with boys. It's anti-competitive. While baseball and basketball present a constant threat of personal disgrace, and while it's no stroll on the beach to be on ice with a puck flying around at 100 miles an hour, and while after a football game ambulances carry off the wounded, soccer games offer very few point scores and very few prospects of, quote, personal disgrace or major injury. It's elitist, or more specifically liberal. Force-fed to the American public by the same entities demanding that we love HBO's Girls, Light Rail, and Hillary Clinton. Unlike soccer, she asserts, we don't have to be endlessly told how exciting football is. It's foreign, and in no small way by virtue of its foreignness, it is similar to the metric system, which liberals adore because it's European, but which Coulter portrays as amorphous, abstract, and utterly non-intuitive. Coulter is well known for her bombastic proclamations, but as is often the case with populist social critique such as this, such proclamations speak to a very real undercurrent of American anxiety in the face of broad social and political shifts that strike many as antithetical to the American way of life. In this presentation, I want to propose that we give Coulter's words some serious consideration, at least for the next 40 minutes or so. Why should we do this? Because proclamations such as those offered by Coulter are ultimately designed to do more than just articulate American anxieties, and more than just validate a crotchety vision of the decline of contemporary American society. They're designed to channel these anxieties and complaints toward particular culprits and particular solutions. To the extent that such proclamations are successful in articulating and channeling the anxieties of segments of the American population, it is important to give serious consideration to their content. I've been exploring and presenting on materials like this for a few years now, and I have to say, if there's anything the 2016 election has done to make my life easier, It's the fact that unlike even just a couple of years ago, I no longer have to work to talk people into devoting some serious attention to someone like Ann Coulter, Glenn Beck, or even pre-President Donald Trump. In fact, there was a time not so long ago when I was told by a student in a religion class, after I played a clip from Glenn Beck's CNN broadcast, that Beck was too fringe and therefore an inaccurate representation of a certain brand of American conservatism. Today, times have changed. And I suspect that I don't have to work as hard as I would have once had to work to convince you that there might be some value in thinking seriously about Coulter's portrayal of the current state of the country. But still, just in case anyone isn't quite convinced, in a few minutes I'll play a clip from our current US president expressing sentiments strikingly similar to Coulter's sentiments. So just rest assured. While I'm on the subject of taking the words of fringe people seriously, though, I want to be very clear about what I'm arguing for here. I'm not going to try to make the case that we should be giving serious consideration to neo-Nazis or white supremacist groups. People within these groups actually do have quite a bit to say about human rights, as you can probably imagine. And in some sense, I can imagine that a case might be made for why we should also give some consideration to their views as well, actually, in some circumstances. If for no other reason than to have a better understanding of the world we live in. But that's not what I'm going to do here. When I say that I'm going to talk about human rights in the era of the alt-right, what I mean is that I want to explore a more mainstream kind of hostility to human rights. A hostility that unquestionably shares certain features with elements of the far right, but that in most cases is less overt and less self-consciously supremacist than the alt-right proper. It might be accurate to call this demographic something like the alt-light, which is a dismissive term that prominent alt-right figures have given to conservatives who embrace a kind of civic nationalism, but who refuse to take this nationalism into the realm of overt racial or ethnic nationalism, the alt-light. Ultimately, though, I would extend my categorization of this demographic even beyond the alt-light to encompass a kind of broader swath of politically conservative and even libertarian Americans who subscribe to a vision of American exceptionalism that they understand to be under threat from something that they often refer to as globalism. I'm going to unpack the terms exceptionalism and globalism as I go on in this talk. So as I say this, I'm well aware of the fact that there are many who would make the case that there's no significant difference between your average Trump voter and, for example, one of these guys from the summer's Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville. If somebody wants to push me during the Q&A, I will talk in more detail about why I find this blanket categorization both wrong and supremely unhelpful for understanding, much less dealing with, our current political climate. For now, though, I'll just say that I am proposing that we take Coulter's words as emblematic of a particular American sensibility that is broadly, often kind of viscerally resistant to human rights ideals and institutions, and that we try to understand what this is about. I'm going to propose that the field of religious studies offers some valuable insight into this phenomenon. So here is a very basic outline of the argument that I want to make. I want to talk a little bit further about the idea of soccer as an analogy for human rights. Then I want to talk about human rights as a religious narrative. And then finally, I want to talk about what I would call a clash of civil religions, one being human rights universalism and the other being a kind of vision of American exceptionalism. Okay, so to return to Coulter just for a minute, I will say that her depiction of soccer reads like a laundry list of conservative suspicions about modern international law and the human rights values at its foundation. When viewed from within this frame, Coulter's complaints about the type of America that would embrace soccer become broader complaints about the type of America that would embrace the ethos of human rights. An ethos that Coulter and other prominent conservative critics portray as egalitarian, anti-competitive, elitist, foreign, and non-intuitive. The distinction that conservative human rights skeptics draw between human rights values and American values is itself a bit non-intuitive, considering how prone Americans are to think of this country as a human rights role model, and considering the kind of quasi-mythology that has been built up surrounding the role of American icons like Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt in the construction of human rights in the 1940s. I think there's an interesting kind of contrast there. The distinction between American values and human rights values, however, begins to make sense when we appreciate the way in which human rights values and international law more generally operate both in practice and in principle in contrast to a whole set of American interests. Okay, in the words of Paul Kahn, any legal system that operates with human rights values as a central tenet begins, at least in principle, with an idea of equality among subjects. For domestic law, this is an equality among individuals. For international law, it's an equality among states. Legal outcomes are determined by identifying claims of right, not by measuring assertions of power. This principle of equality among subjects unquestionably leads to certain practical discomforts for those committed to the hegemony of the United States. As Kahn puts it, appeals to international law have been one of the tools available to weaker states in their battles with more powerful states. Conversely, powerful states have been wary of adjudicatory mechanisms for settling disputes. It is easy to find examples of this more pragmatic brand of human rights skepticism. But these pragmatic concerns about the preservation of American interests are actually just one feature of the conservative discomfort with human rights law, and I would argue not nearly the most important feature for making sense of the visceral, intuitive language that Coulter and other critics typically use. Coulter's soccer analogy positions such systems not merely as antithetical to American interests, but as antithetical to fundamental American values, and this is what I want to understand a little bit more of. Tillerson's position on human rights is relevant and worth exploring, certainly, but what I'm interested in is language along the lines of Glenn Beck's description of what he calls global governance. A number of years ago, when Paramount Pictures released a GI Joe movie in which GI Joe was portrayed as a soldier working for an international institution similar to the United Nations, rather than as a soldier of the United States, Beck offered the following warning to his audience. GI Joe is the last casualty in the war against the American way, and I know, Glenn, it's just a toy, a little hunk of plastic, a cartoon. And that makes it easy to dismiss, but I believe that that would be a huge mistake. We cannot lose sight of the fact that G.I. Joe is a real guy, and he is something more as well. He is a symbol, and when you attack a symbol, you strike a blow against everything it represents. Americans have always been a divinely inspired nation. We must preserve our symbols of national pride and power, be they a flag, a cross, characters like Superman or G.I. Joe. Parents, don't let this slip away. We've got to teach our children to respect the values that this nation is founded on, and whether it's the promise of Ronald Reagan's shining city on a hill or a metropolis kept safe by Superman, we must never let our children lose sight of the nobility in truth, justice, and the American way. To offer a more recent and considerably less flowery example of what I'm talking about, consider David French's description of the ideal of universalism. Our previous presidents, and indeed much of the intellectual establishment, left and right, have sold the American people on a false bill of goods about human nature, their own history, and the role of culture in the inculcation of our civilizational values. What we have here is two demonstrations of a conflict between contrasting systems of value, systems that invoke different symbols, narratives, identities, and visceral commitments. It's at this level of conflict that I want to explore. So, I'm going to shift here to the second point in this talk, the point about human rights as a religious narrative. I want to talk for a bit about the ways in which human rights function as a religious narrative akin to lots of other religious narratives. To do this, we might start by asking what constitutes a religious narrative in the first place. Presumably there are narratives that don't qualify as religious narratives, but what is it exactly that makes a narrative religious? Its grounding within a widely recognized religious tradition, its deployment by a person claiming to be religious, whether or not that person is part of an institutionalized religious tradition. Does a narrative's level of authority take it from being a regular narrative to a religious narrative? These are the religious studies kinds of questions that have interested me for a long time, and it's these questions that inspired me to write the book on the role of religion and secularism in human rights. In that book, I made the case that human rights are about more than an enumeration of particular tenets and prohibitions, that human rights involve a narrative designed to produce particular deep-seated sensibilities and moral orientations. For those of you who are skeptical about the idea that human rights function in this way, let's turn for a moment to the preamble to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And of course, there is an update that has popped up on the screen, which just... So, you don't have to read all of this. I'm going to walk through it. Okay? Political preambles like this are designed to convey authority and to inspire particular types of identity and behavior. In other words, before the Universal Declaration ever gets to its enumeration of particular rights, it narrates a foundation for these rights. It describes where such rights come from, how we know that we have them, and why it is that we have come to see the need for their reiteration in a given moment. Political narratives like this are often permeated with elements that we might describe as kind of almost faith claims, and the Declaration is no exception to this. The preamble to the Declaration makes a claim of inherent dignity. It makes a claim about the equal and inalienable rights of all people. It makes a claim about universal membership in the human family. It claims to speak for the highest aspirations of the common people. And it makes an outright declaration of faith in fundamental rights and the dignity and worth of the human person. The Declaration claims to be a vehicle for promoting, and not just particular rights, but universal respect for these rights. And it proclaims an aspiration to create a world in which every individual and every organ of society will keep the Declaration constantly in mind as a point of political and ethical orientation from now on, presumably out of a conviction that the Declaration represents the surest means of improving the world. Given these elements, is there anything that might make us hesitant to understand the Declaration as a kind of religious narrative? Well, this document makes absolutely no reference to a deity, or even to a higher system of order like destiny, or providence, or nature. The Declaration is radically immanent or this worldly, and perhaps this is a reason to hesitate to think of this particular narrative as having a religious logic. Another reason that we might hesitate to think of the Declaration as a religious narrative is that the members of the First Commission on Human Rights, the people who spent 2 years drafting this document, emphatically denied that the Declaration represented a religious narrative of human rights. To the contrary, they worked diligently to create a preamble that would lay a thoroughly secular foundation for the Declaration's rights. As the Commissioner's chairwoman, Eleanor Roosevelt, describes the Commission's work, "I happen to believe that we are born free and equal in dignity and rights because there is a divine creator and there is a divine spark in men. But there were other commission members who wanted it expressed in such a way that they could think in their particular way about the question. And finally, these words were agreed upon because they stated in fact that all men are born free and equal, but they left each of us to put it in our own reason, as we say, for that end." Roosevelt's understanding of the Declaration's secular mandate was shared by almost all of her colleagues on the Commission. Is this perhaps another reason to hesitate to think of this narrative as a religious narrative? It's probably pretty clear to you, I assume, at this point that I think there are actually really good reasons for analyzing human rights through the lens of religion. As I said earlier, I wrote a book for that purpose and that explores what I call the mythic qualities of the Universal Declaration, and right now it's going to look like I'm totally grandstanding since you've already mentioned my book, but there it is, just in case. It's important to me that you see the title of the book and not so much the author of the book, to kind of understand where I'm going to go with this. Now, typically, to associate human rights with myth risks being perceived as advocating for a dismissal or even a rejection of human rights. Indeed, when the term myth is used in conjunction with human rights, it is almost always done so in almost all of the literature that brings those two terms together. It's almost always done so with the intention of discrediting either the idea or the substance of human rights. As a scholar of religion, however, I've argued not only that it is misleading to think of myth in this way, but that this tendency to associate myth with error or duplicity actually prevents us from recognizing some important insights that the category of myth sheds upon the history and the logic of human rights. Let's think back just for a moment to the Declaration that I just showed you. This document was advertised by its creators as emphatically secular, even as these creators regularly used religious languages of sacredness, veneration, and teleology to describe the document and to describe human rights. The Declaration proposes no mechanisms for the enforcement of its provisions, yet there's much evidence to indicate that it has come to command a significant moral authority, and indeed, that the First Commission on Human Rights actively inspired to imbue it with such an extrajuridical moral authority. They worked hard to do that. Ultimately, in fact, there's much in the historical record of the creation of the Declaration to indicate that many Commission members were deeply convinced of its capacity to transform not just the ethical, but even the metaphysical landscape of international law. The phenomenon of myth provides a valuable lens through which to make sense of these various conflicting elements in the Declaration. Far from understanding myth as a mode of erroneous or deceptive discourse, scholars in the field of religious studies understand myth as a form of human labor that serves the function of generating meaning, solidarity, and order within all manner of human communities. Far from being characterized by their inaccuracy or duplicity, myths are characterized within the study of religion by the particular authority they wield and the particular strategies their creators use to imbue them with this authority. In short, instead of offering arguments or strictures, myths are narratives that assert their descriptions of the world and the moral imperatives stemming from these descriptions in a way that makes them appear beyond dispute. Mythmakers accomplish this authoritative assertion of information in a variety of ways. For example, by describing the prescriptions of supernatural beings, by narrating the feats of exemplary figures from earlier times, or by drawing connections between the present and a paradigmatic moment in the past. In all of their variety, such narratives are united in their effort to set language to the task of, in the words of Roland Barthes, lending in historical intention a natural justification and making the contingent appear eternal. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights obviously makes no appeal to supernatural realms or superhuman beings. It does, however, narrate its basic tenets in the unequivocal manner characteristic of myth. The framers of the Declaration aspired to generate a document capable of rectifying the horrors of the World War II era, and they aim to do so not merely by enumerating certain rights, but by establishing why we have rights to begin with, as Eleanor Roosevelt famously put it. Right? So not just establishing rights, but establishing why we have rights to begin with. To accomplish this, the Commission worked to imbue the Declaration with a logic that would place its basic tenets beyond question. They worked, in other words, to create a secular narrative capable of wielding the authority of a religious one. A narrative that would appear to everyday people, in the words of one Commission delegate, as simple and as clear as the Ten Commandments. How does one create a Ten Commandments that is sufficiently secularized to command global consensus? This problem of how to articulate a set of evocative principles in the absence of shared metaphysical foundations reaches to the heart of the 20th Century Human Rights Project. Members of the Commission recognized early in their negotiations that a human rights vision geared toward a global audience could not ground its claims within any culturally specific worldview, lest it appear to be imposing rather than merely reiterating fundamental values. In the face of this conundrum, the Commission simply proclaimed, in the very first words of the Declaration, the inherence of human dignity, a proclamation made, as is often the case with myth, without rational argumentation of any sort. Inherent human dignity functions within the Declaration as an axiom, located beyond dispute or question, a characteristic that, as one human rights scholar puts it, no person and no political or social body or organ gave to us, and that therefore no person or political or social body is empowered to take away from us. Such dignity functions in the Declaration not merely as an elementary human characteristic, but as one Commission delegate put it, as an absolute and general principle at the heart of the Declaration. Much more than a basic human trait, inherent dignity serves within the Declaration as a sacred center, an item unequivocally set apart for veneration as both an emblem of human rights and a mechanism for the faithful observance of the Declaration's prescriptions. When I refer to sacredness here, I'm drawing upon a scholarly definition of this term common within the field of religious studies. I'm referring to an active narrative or ritual setting apart for the purpose of generating a particular moral orientation, and ideally a broader social and or political world deeply informed by that moral orientation. Such gestures of setting apart serve, when they are successful, to create symbols, objects, sentiments, and practices that are experienced as expressions of normative, absolute reality. To put it another way, sacredness is the invocation of an absoluteness, or the adherence to specific values about which there is little or no question. Now, of course, this approach to the sacred does not necessarily speak to the question of whether such efforts at setting apart ultimately prove to be successful. That is a somewhat different question, and also obviously an important and relevant question where human rights are concerned. For the moment, though, I want to set aside the matter of the Commission's ultimate success or failure in narrating human dignity into an item of global sacredness, and just wrap up my analysis of the religious logic of the Declaration. Okay, so to wrap up, I'll say this. The scholarly category of myth allows us to appreciate the manner in which the First Commission on Human Rights endeavored, at a seminal moment in the history of international law, to create a narrative that would push deliberately against two long-standing human tendencies. First, the tendency to tie human rights to one's membership to tie human rights to one's membership within a particular political community, right? So they wanted to avoid tying the human rights to a particular kind of set of like a civic arrangement. And second, the tendency to hearken to the realm of the divine when building a foundation for political ideals and practices. Okay, this twofold endeavor gave rise to a document the likes of which has never been seen. A declaration that predicates its tenets upon a universal, secular human reality that it brings into existence through no other means than by professing to recognize this reality. This is a truly novel political maneuver, but for all of its novelty, it is also a maneuver that partakes of the time-honored logic of myth-making, a logic wherein language is set to the task of unequivocally presenting a vision of the world, as well as a set of mandates appropriate to the maintenance of that vision. The Declaration's unique narrative complicates conventional distinctions between religion and secularism, and in so doing sheds new light not only on these often taken for granted categories, but on the nature of human rights themselves. Okay, so I know that this can all sound a little bit academic, and maybe even like I've kind of tricked you into sitting in on a theory, method, and the study of religion seminar, so I'm going to shift gears now. What I will say is something like this. Like, yeah, this can sound a little bit academic, but what I want to make clear is that narratives like the one I've been tracing in the Universal Declaration can be extremely significant within particular political and social contexts. Easily as significant or more significant than more formal institutions such as courts of law and legislative bodies. Indeed, what recent populist upsurges around the world have made clear is the manner in which the health of our formal political institutions frequently depends on the flourishing of more informal norms. Norms such as transparency, civil discourse, rule of law, and equal treatment of all members of a community. Without the undergirding of such informal norms, the formal institutions that a particular society has put in place can appear alienating or even oppressive to its citizens. And powerful narratives play an indispensable role in creating and cultivating particular informal norms. And also, of course, they play an important role in disputing and eroding other informal norms. So with all of that in mind, let's turn to the third item in this talk, the issue of conflicting civil religions. I've already hinted at some of the quite practical ways in which human rights ideals and institutions can grate against certain fundamental American interests. But what I really want to appreciate is the way in which human rights ideals and institutions can also be perceived to grate against certain fundamental American values. To understand this, I will argue that we have to appreciate the way in which modern human rights values conflict with a deep vein of American civil religion. Now, thanks in large part to Robert Bellah, who wrote a well-known article on this topic in the 1960s, people typically associate American civil religion with a benevolent, informal force of meaning-making and social cohesion, a set of common discourses and practices that have brought Americans together into agreement and activism throughout the history of this country. American civil religion is not religious in a doctrinal sense of the term, but it has a generically Christian quality to it. Bellah cites Lincoln's second inaugural address as a preeminent example of such a discourse, so I want to look at this just for a sec. Okay, this is from Lincoln. If we shall suppose that American slavery is one of those offenses which, in the providence of God, must needs come, but which, having continued through his appointed time, he now wills to remove, and that he gives to both North and South this terrible war as the woe due to those by whom the offense came, shall we discern therein any departure from those divine attributes which the believers in a living God always ascribe to him? Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet, if God wills that it continue, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. Lincoln's speech, like many discourses of American civil religion, served at a pivotal moment to make sense of America's moral failings, to locate the Civil War within a coherent context of meaning, and to enlist a divided country into a common moral and political enterprise. This narrative has particular appeal for a certain kind of theist, for the obvious reason that it channels American struggles and even outright tragedies into a narrative of divine providence. But this is obviously not the kind of meek shall inherit the earth kind of Christianity that many people tend to think of as the essence of Christianity. In fact, such civil religious narratives can serve just as compellingly as mechanisms for placing a divine stamp of approval on American successes and prosperities of all sorts, including military and other conquests, right? It's not just about the meek shall inherit the earth, but in fact, so the civil religion can actually put a kind of imprimatur onto much more assertive kinds of activities as well. Okay, this is John Winthrop's famous city upon a hill description. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies. When he shall make us a praise and glory that men shall save succeeding plantations, may the Lord make it like that of New England. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of the people are upon us. Notice the martial quality of this vision of American exceptionalism. The idea that one of the surest ways we can be assured of God's favor is through our successes in combat and struggle. In fact, while many people have concluded from Robert Bellah's description of civil religion that it is generally a force for peace, integration, and a sort of broad democratic mindedness, Bellah himself hints that this is not all there is to American civil religion. That this powerful quasi-Christian discourse does not always work in the service of what he calls an expansionary and optimistic politics. Indeed, it is not at all difficult to recognize the manner in which certain circumstances might just as readily give rise to more exclusivist and combative forms of civil religion. I'll just mention also that civil religious language like this does not speak only to American Christians, despite its historical entrenchment within a kind of Christian sensibility. This type of language can just as readily be deployed to speak to a religiously pluralistic or even to a secular audience. The infamous alt-right figure, Richard Spencer, has deployed a secularized version of this discourse on numerous occasions to very interesting effect. Okay, this more exclusivist, combative form of civil religion is, of course, precisely the idiom that Coulter and her ilk are trading in. Coulter's critique of soccer's expansive, egalitarian, and non-hegemonic logics furnishes the foundation for an implicit call to resistance, a call to her audience to recommit themselves to the inverse, to real American values of exceptionalism, meritocracy, and political and perhaps military assertiveness. Her audience is encouraged not merely to view soccer values as elitist, foreign, and non-intuitive, but as in direct conflict with this real American identity and this authentic American system of values. It's a small step from here to conclude that human rights values and the political and legal instruments used to propagate and enforce these values are essentially the impositions of elite, aloof lawyers and activists and politicians. Needless to say, a foreign system of values imposed in this manner appears not just undesirable to many Americans, but profoundly suspicious. It butts up against what Kahn calls the American myth of popular sovereignty. That is, the widespread American assumption that unless an assertion of governmental authority can be traced to an act of popular sovereignty, it is illegitimate. Kahn's use of the word myth here has two meanings. it can refer in the first place to the basic deceptiveness of this notion of popular sovereignty. In other words, he uses the word myth in the first in the more colloquial and common sense of the term. After all, there are a whole host of historical and structural elements in the American political system that stand in the way of pure popular sovereignty. Okay, but additionally, Kahn's use of the word myth also speaks pointedly to the religious studies formulation of the term that I described a few moments ago. This version of myth speaks to the manner in which the notion of popular sovereignty serves as a fulcrum for a whole speaks as a fulcrum for a whole matrix of visceral beliefs and commitments among Americans. Its deep-seated visceral quality embodies precisely the type of allure that the first Human Rights Commission aspired to infuse into the Declaration. But of course, the American narrative of popular sovereignty has had much more time to take root, and it wields the advantage of a kind of localism and immediacy that universal human rights have always struggled to achieve. There's actually an entire area of critical scholarship that has arisen in recent years, claiming that human rights values often conflict in deep ways with pre-existing systems of value, despite their universalist aspirations. This cultural relativist critique of human rights, as it's called, focuses on the question of whether the priority that human rights discourse gives to human rights over other values is itself a universally valid value. The cultural relativist critique is typically associated with non-Western skepticism about human rights. And I think one of the fascinating things about this American brand of human rights skepticism is the way in which it forces us to re-examine this tendency to think of cultural relativism as primarily a non-Western phenomenon. Let's look at a recent example of this tension. I'm going to turn to a recent Twitter exchange because obviously, of course, no analysis of American politics would be complete without an analysis of Twitter. So we'll just go with this. Okay, on the day that Trump announced that the US would withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, Harvard professor Joyce Chaplin noted the irony that the USA, which had been created by the international community in the Treaty of Paris in 1783, had now betrayed the international community by withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. Here's US Senator Ted Cruz's response. The USA wasn't created through an international treaty process, but through an almost totally self-contained, we might say kind of a sovereign alchemy of, quote, declaration plus war plus constitution. Now, I say that this alchemy is almost completely self-contained because, of course, it's not totally self-contained. In Cruz's narrative, the creation of the US definitely required an external international enabler. Can anyone see who that is in here? Who's the enabler? The British. The British. Right? The globalist par excellence of the 18th century, right? It's the British that's the external enabler. This is a crucial element of this American narrative of popular sovereignty, this sense that the US earned its national standing within the global community, and through armed combat, no less. Lest his audience be left with any doubt about how this particular brand of combative meritocracy works, Cruzs elaborates. The USA is not a product of the international community, but rather a product of force, the blood of patriots, and we the people. Cruz's depiction of the genesis of the United States possesses an immediacy and a sense of vigorous agency that is very hard for an international institution like the United Nations to replicate. And this is true even though the events he's making reference to are events from America's distant past. This is the mark of a very effective myth, by the way, a narrative that functions over many generations to viscerally call forth a set of beliefs and commitments within a particular community. Cruzs is well aware of the power differential between these two competing narratives about the creation of the United States, as you can see from the final installment in his mini tweet storm, in which he literally reduces the world of global governance to a hollow shell. Cruz's exchange with Chaplin affords us a glimpse into the logic of populist resistance to human rights ideals and institutions from within a liberal democracy. Though human rights don't specifically surface in this exchange, Cruzs is articulating an aversion to the notion of global governance that directly mirrors contemporary anti-human rights language prevalent among the alt-right, and indeed among a broad swath of American conservatives. Though this type of resistance can take a variety of possible forms and lead to a variety of behaviors, one of the things that we can see here is that Cruzs is overtly framing a rejection of the ideal of global governance as a vehicle for a return to America's true heritage. Within Cruz's idea of things, a rejection of the self-effacement that comes with an enlistment into a global community of equals is one of the elements necessary to make America great again. Cruz's depiction of America's creation is simultaneously historical and deeply existential. Like Lincoln's portrayal of the Civil War, it makes sense of America's development and current standing in the world through an exceptionalist language of combative self-fashioning, rather than through a universalist language of inherence and innateness. In relation to the visceral quality of Cruz's description, the Declaration's language of universal human rights runs the risk of coming off as abstract, bureaucratic, and foreign. the language of inherence, the insistence that nations and the individuals who comprise them are entitled to be equal players within the international community, rather than distinguished by their unique compositions, can easily appear to be an implicit demand that America and Americans relinquish their hard-won and perhaps even God-given exceptionalism. And while it's at it, this language appears to demand of Americans that they hand over a portion of the nation's governing authority to an organization that looks very much like a kind of global Supreme Court. I won't go into the issue of conservative hostility toward the US judicial branch here, but suffice it to say that it's not at all hard to find unaccountable leftist judges implicated in this critique of anti-patriotic global governance. Barack Obama, as you can see, also gets a shout out and is regularly kind of enfolded into this narrative as well. So now let's turn to President Trump. I gave a presentation to a group of students a couple of weeks ago on another research project I'm working on, and as part of that presentation, I asked them to think for a moment about what it means for people to describe Trump's presidency as either a success or a failure. I asked them to consider the possibility that the Americans who continue to stand by Trump, despite his recent personnel and policy problems, aren't just completely craven or deluded, and instead to consider the possibility that they are simply measuring success and failure by a different set of criteria than the ones that these students might be using. With that in mind, and bearing in mind everything I've just been talking about, I would like to ask you to imagine the impact for a particular type of Trump supporter of watching Trump stand in front of the United Nations, as he did in September, and saying what he says here. Just to be clear, when he starts off by referring to this organization, he's referring to the UN, and we're going to jump right into the middle of the speech.
If this organization is to have any hope of successfully confronting the challenges before us, it will depend, as some 70 years ago, on the independent strength of its members. If we are to embrace the opportunities of the future and overcome the present dangers together, there can be no substitute for strong, sovereign, and independent nations. Nations that are rooted in their histories and invested in their destinies. Nations that seek allies to befriend, not enemies to conquer. And most important of all, nations that are home to patriots, to men and women who are willing to sacrifice for their countries, their fellow citizens, and for all that is best in the human spirit. In remembering the great victory that led to this body's founding, we must never forget that those heroes who fought against evil also fought for the nations that they loved. Patriotism led the Poles to die to save Poland, the French to fight for a free France, and the Brits to stand strong for Britain. Today, if we do not invest ourselves, our hearts, and our minds in our nations, if we will not build strong families, safe communities, and healthy societies for ourselves, no one can do it for us. We cannot wait for someone else, for faraway countries or far-off bureaucracies. We can't do it. We must solve our problems to build our prosperity, to secure our future, or we will build vulnerable to decay, domination, and defeat. The true question for the United Nations today, for people all over the world who hope for better lives for themselves and their children, is a basic one. Are we still patriots? Do we love our nations enough to protect their sovereignty and to take ownership of their futures? Do we revere them enough to defend their interests, preserve their cultures, and ensure a peaceful world for their citizens? One of the greatest American patriots, John Adams, wrote that the American Revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people. That was the moment when America awoke, when we looked around and understood that we were a nation. We realized who we were, what we valued, and what we would give our lives to defend. From its very first moments, the American story is the story of what is possible when people take ownership of their future.
Okay, David Brooks recently proposed that many of Trump's supporters follow him not because he gets facts right, but because he gets his myths right. However you feel about its style and content, Trump's UN speech is unquestionably an example of getting a particular myth right. The ideal of universal human rights and the institutions tasked with propagating this ideal stand at the center of Trump's narrative here, but they do not. That is, human rights and the UN, they stand at the center of Trump's narrative, but they stand at the center as a foil, not as a foundation, right? They are a constant foil against which he is pushing in this speech. To understand how certain Americans might come to perceive human rights as such a threat, it's crucial to appreciate the manner in which universal human rights, even in their most secularized guise, aspire in the way of all myths to engender deep-seated human loyalties. Loyalties that operate on a register well beyond mere social or political pragmatism. In aspiring to engender such loyalties, however, human rights always risk falling into deep conflict with the more immediate and long-standing narratives that bind people to their particular parochial communities and identities. The current political landscape in America allows us to push against the stereotype of human rights resistors as coming only from outside of the West or outside of the Judeo-Christian religious tradition. It also affords us an understanding of the ongoing delicacy of the Human Rights Project itself. And it's for these reasons that I think these topics are valuable to explore. So that's all. Thanks.
And we have some time for questions, and I think Professor Reinbold will field.
Sure. You know what I'm going to say, right, students? No, you don't. Usually we defer to students first. So if students have questions, you should ask a question first. Yes, Kate?
So in, obviously, the Bill of Rights, or in most interpretations of United States kind of founding documents, there's this idea of like Christian kind of narrative. And do you think that if for example, like we didn't have that rights are endowed by our creator or a creator at all, and that it just was written that rights are framed on the basis of human dignity, that things would change and the political climate would be any different than it is today?
I don't really think that, no. So one thing I will say is that the Bill of Rights doesn't say anything about God or about religion. I mean, it does say things about religion, but what it says about religion is, like, we can't establish religion and we can't prohibit the free exercise of religion. But you're right. I mean, the idea of being endowed by a creator with rights, this is from the U.S. Declaration of Independence. And again, this is one of the things that really has interested me in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is the way in which, unlike something like the U.S. Declaration, there is no reference to a kind of creator at all, or anything, any kind of transcendent thing at all. There's no nature, none of that kind of stuff. So I think, I mean, first of all, I think it would have been very strange for the U.S. Declaration of Independence not to have contained a reference to a creator, because part of what the U.S. Declaration of Independence was doing, like lots of declarations, was it wasn't just saying, here's what we want, it was saying, here's why we are entitled to be asking for what it is that we want. And the way, I mean, throughout most of these kinds of declarations, the French Declaration does something very similar. Like, the way that you explain your entitlement to something that you want is by saying that there's some sort of cosmic, reason for why it is that you're entitled to ask for the things that you're entitled to. And so I think it would have been strange not to have had that kind of language in the Declaration. If it hadn't been there, though, I mean, I'm not convinced that would have really had an effect, because the U.S. Constitution, and again the Bill of Rights, doesn't proclaim the U.S. to be a Christian nation at all. And in fact, when kind of religious conservatives attempt to describe the U.S. as a Christian nation, skeptics will immediately point to the Constitution, right, and say, where exactly does it say that in the Constitution? And there's really nowhere that you can get that kind of thing from the Constitution. So I think of American civil religion, this is very much in the spirit of somebody like Robert Bella, as being not necessarily something that's codified in particular kinds of, it's not politically codified, with the exception, I guess, of the Declaration, but it's much more nebulous than that. And I think that it would be, I think it's harder to imagine how you would, reform something like that, right? These kind of common, long-standing sentiments and practices. I'm not sure if that answers your question. So. Yes.
Can I ask a question? About like two things that it seemed to me were bringing together, but I wonder if they have to come together. One could be a supporter or an endorser of sort of universal human rights, and deeply skeptical of a global political community, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it sounds like so you've got a lot of quotations of people who are deeply skeptical of a global political community, but since those two can come apart, I don't see why that thereby establishes that they're skeptical about human rights.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. I do think those things can be separated, but I don't think that there is any sense, at least in the kind of world that I have been looking at that I was describing here, that I don't think there's any sense that they are systematically separated from each other. I think that the two ideas kind of carry back and forth quite a bit, and I guess the reason I would say that is that is the way in which. That's why I think that maybe like the Coulter description, part of the reason I started out with that is that I think that's a good description of the way in which the kind of global and all of these like very kind of liberal, like wishy-washy kinds of values are sort of understood to inhere together. So no, I don't think that they have to be together, but I think that they, I guess I should say I think that they easily kind of permeate back and forth into each other. Yeah.
But can I just quickly follow up? So this is a related question about sort of another conflict I think you set up in your third proposition or something about human rights universalism versus American exceptionalism. Like, couldn't I be, and haven't there been lots of defenders of American exceptionalism who believe it has a sort of very singular and unique role to play in world history? And one way of understanding that role is to ensure the spread of very important universal human rights.
Yes. Yeah.
So is it with this administration that we have this alleged opposition between human rights universalism and American exceptionalism? It's not built into the notion of exceptionalism that you reject human rights.
No, I do no.
Yeah.
And if that's what I implied, then that's not what I intended to imply. No, I don't think that there is. What I was kind of interested in engaging in this talk, and what I'm interested kind of more broadly, or more, I guess more specifically in with this project, is people who do see a conflict between American exceptionalism and, again, more than just global governance, but a kind of like system of values that that deprioritizes a kind of meritocracy. And I think meritocracy can mean lots and lots of different things, right? But all of the things that are understood to encourage people to reach for greatness in some way. So I don't think that it's the only possible kind of tension between those various things, but that's the one that I'm interested in looking at. So no, I mean, it's totally true that there's a brand of American exceptionalism that would say that human rights are part of are essentially an American kind of set of values, and we should help to spread those around the world. That's not exactly the kind of crowd that I'm interested in, but yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yes?
Thanks, Jenna. This was really, really interesting. A little bit in line with what Dave was asking you. My question is about the way you tell the story. There seems to be an implied length of the history of American exceptionalism, and you take us back to Winthrop, whereas the human rights universalism begins in 45, begin 48. Like it's a relatively recent invention, and there's a way in which I'm tempted to think that it's more like either they're both just as old, and it's the French Revolution in both cases, or something like this. They're both alleged revolutions, old discourses. Or I'm even more inclined to say that they're both created right around the same time in the 30s and 40s. And many of them are being born both at the same time in America even, potentially. Sometimes maybe like this thing, by the same people, even if they then diverge and go in different directions. I guess I started thinking of this when you invoke FDR and Eleanor and say, like, it's kind of weird that we have this myth about them, and yet there's these people that are so angry about but from the moment that the Roosevelts were involved in doing this stuff, there were the DuPonts and the major American conservatives who were so angry at the Roosevelts and thought that they were destroying America and were helping to invent this American exceptionalism as part of it. an explanation of what's wrong with the Roosevelts. And I wonder if it actually, like, if it could help you in some ways to be able to put these things in the same time scale instead of allowing, because I don't know, it feels like Winthrop then gives some weight to the sense that there's this much older American tradition
Right.
that's in this new on-the-scene guy, whereas Winthrop, no one cares about Winthrop until Reagan
Right.
comes back up in the 80s.
Yeah, well, again, I may have erred in making it seem as though I was like implying that I was tracing things back to John Winthrop or something like that. I think the thing about Winthrop, I mean, Reagan is a perfect example of this, right? Reagan brings him into the present, right, as a way to say, like, look at the kind of venerable quality of this idea, right? And I think that when like Glenn Beck mentions Reagan mentioning the city on a hill, he's doing the same thing, right? He's pulling Reagan kind of into the present. So I don't think of this as like weaving a backwards narrative that goes all the way back to the 17th century or something like that. I think it's a really interesting question, actually. But the project that I'm working on right now, and that I really want to kind of that this is just like a kind of smaller portion of this project that I'm working on, is really thinking about this kind of anti-human rights rhetoric in the post 9/11 era. So really thinking about it like quite recently, rather than thinking of it as going back farther than that. But I think it's almost always the case that you're going to have people reaching back to these kinds of important these important iconic figures and bringing them into the present as a way of kind of supporting that. That doesn't mean that I would subscribe to the notion that Winthrop himself was, anti-Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which of course didn't exist when Winthrop was speaking. But I do think that these kinds of figures are a little bit, it's more. I think with kind of like very kind of heavy mythic narratives like this, I think it's hard to keep things in a kind of reasonable chronology, I guess is what I would say. So, but it's a totally good point. I mean, that you're raising. I think it's really, it was not my intention to try to write a history in that way. So yeah, yes.
Do you ever look at the ways in which this specific group, this specific train of thought of this conflict between human rights and American Universalism functions sort of within America, in ways to associate certain groups within America with this, not just liberals, with this external thing, this well, we can't, we don't want to be helping immigrants even though they're in America, and they might be American, because they're associated with not American, the ways that almost international human rights are almost they're international human rights aren't worth it, but also groups domestic groups are considered under this blanket of international human rights and liberal if we took care of Black Americans and immigrant Americans, then it would be the same thing as taking care of human rights.
Yeah. So one of the things that Coulter says in her description of soccer, I didn't put it up here, but she says something at the end, do you know why soccer is popular right now? Nobody whose great-grandfather was born in the United States cares about soccer. The reason soccer is popular is because of immigration, right? Immigration in the United States, that's why, right? And so she sort of adds another layer onto this, right? Which is that this soccer, which is already so kind of anathema to American values and whatnot, is also only made possible, right? This enthusiasm for soccer is only made possible because you have non-Americans who've come in and made it popular. So I do, I think that, I didn't dwell on that, but I think that it's not at all hard, I think, to find this being funneled into or sort of connected into a kind of a particular stance on immigration. I mean, immigration, I think, particularly, but there are other things that come into that as well. I don't want to go into a total maze of complex things, but it's interesting that the issue of abortion comes into this in really interesting ways. Well, certain kind of big culture war issues like abortion and same-sex marriage come into this too. This has to do with what I said about sort of liberal judges, right? These people who are not elected by the American people, so they also are understood to kind of fall outside of the realm, the kind of normal realm of American popular sovereignty. I think it can connect to a whole bunch of other things as well. Yeah, I mean the talk, the Lampert series is on human rights, so that's sort of what I was trying to. That's really what I was kind of focusing on, but I think that there are definitely other broader ways in which this you can see this play out too. Yeah.
Maybe time for one last question.
Oh.
Maybe you should use the
I could also ask. You could also ask. Is there anybody other than those two who I see all the time who wants to ask a question? Yes. Oh, sure. We hardly ever see each other.
I want to say.
Okay, well, it's sort of a follow-up on David McCabe's question, but it's related to the answer you just gave, I think, too. So I was sort of thinking about the particular right that someone might be comfortable saying, as an American exceptionalist, I still fully support. And there are all sort of things like the free press or voting, where there's no possibility of someone taking away from you as an individual what you had thought was a proper authority role of yours. But both in some of the stuff that I imagine causes trouble now, but also in the language, often in a kind of racist vein, and you suggested at this in the kind of like, oh, those people in the third world who don't get rights. It often would be about something about gender, right? That what's more important than my wife's right to do such and such is my right to live as a man according to certain religious commandments. That comes first. And so I was just wondering if there's something about, like, that there would be certain rights where people are willing to separate the idea of the right from a regime of enforcement, but then rights where it's hard to see how the right could exist at all unless there's some regime of enforcement that runs counter to authority structures that are already present in the culture. Like, you can't give women certain rights unless they have a way to complain when the men around them don't let them exercise those rights.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the use of kind of human rights language. I was talking about this with some students today, and so this is, somebody else brought this up, not me, but it's totally important, I think, to bear in mind, right? That, like, the use of the language of rights is itself very variable, right? Like, we used human rights language. I can't remember credit where credit is due to the student that brought this up at lunch, right? Like, we used human rights language to justify the invasion of Afghanistan, right? Because we were like, women's rights, concerned about women's rights. Was that you?
That's
okay, yeah, could have. So like, I mean, even the I think this is really complicated, right? Even to say that somebody, and again, maybe I erred in describing it as like American exceptionalism versus human rights universalism, because I don't think, and it wasn't my intention to sort of imply that those two things are like static kinds of things. So I don't know if this is exactly relevant to what you're saying, but the Declaration itself contains like a set of rights that were the kind of like America advocated rights, right? The civil and political rights, and then another set of rights. They're like the second half, right? The second half of the rights are rights that were advocated for by Soviet bloc countries that are considered to be the social, economic, and cultural rights that are like all of the rights that Americans think of as like not real rights, right? And so like the right to rest and leisure, and the right to like paid vacations and things like that. So I think even within the Declaration itself, there's a real tension, and ultimately the Declaration itself gave rise to two separate covenants, right? There's a covenant on social and political, a covenant on civil and political rights, and a covenant on social, economic, and cultural rights, because it was clear even from the framing of the Declaration, those two things actually like don't fit together in a way that has a lot of coherence, and so I think that. Yeah, I think that it's kind of a messy business even within the Declaration itself, and I think when you get I think that I'm not sure that answers your question, but it's I don't think that there's what interested me in this, I mean, this sort of starting point for thinking about this project was thinking about, again, this constant reference. This goes back to David's question a little bit. This constant reference within a particular kind of conservative discourse about globalism, universalism, and these kinds of terms that Coulter uses, kind of, equality, but it's equality always couched as a kind of negative thing, right? This idea of just like a kind of insipid equality that reduces human greatness down to just these like sort of, a common denominator or something. Like, that's the kind of stuff that got me interested, but that's not really, none of those things speak to like specific rights outlined in the Declaration per se, so I think that it still leaves lots of room for like, looking at the rights of the Declaration and saying like this, this might be an okay right, and this wouldn't be an okay right. And frankly, I know that we're over time, so I'll just say one other thing. The Covenant on Social and Political Rights, which is a covenant that you would think the U.S. would be like pretty willing to get behind, because it's actually like the stuff that like a lot of it is the stuff that's in our own Bill of Rights. The U.S. Only signed on to that covenant under the express reservation that it would not actually respect any of the social and political rights that conflict with the American Constitution, right? So even the most sort of American-ish of these covenants that came out of the Universal Declaration, the U.S. was had complete reservation about signing on to, and actually reserved the right to exempt itself from any of the things that it would consider to be in conflict with its own constitution. So even the rights that seem to be like most what
would be an example of that?
They didn't say what examples would be. They just said we sign on to this under the condition that we will not uphold any of these rights that we would say. So they didn't enumerate the specific rights that they considered not to fit with the Constitution, probably because rights can be interpreted in different ways, right? I mean, to say that, we were just talking about this over lunch, right? To say that you have a right to religious freedom can mean lots of different things, right? That can, so it's better just to kind of withhold, sort of put out a blanket statement that you will reserve the right to refuse to implement any rights that potentially would conflict. So even the things that seem like most kind of the things that Americans would most subscribe to, as a whole, kind of going back to Dan's point, from the very beginning, these were things that Americans had a lot of reservations about. American politicians had a lot of reservations about. So,
Well, please join me in thanking Professor Reinbold.
Thanks.